Hello, welcome back. I hope you're properly supplied with bagels, muffins, coffee. I want to thank Ben Sachs for inviting me to chair this session. It's an intriguing session. I appreciate the sophisticated audience and conference and presentations pushing bioethics to go into the kinds of questions that lots of us who have spent our time doing clinical bioethics have, I think, unfortunately neglected much too much. Dan Brock gave us a good overview of the kinds of things that he and others have been working on for a long time and that we all need to work on. So this session is, I'm Adrienne Ash, I'm the director of the Center for Ethics at Yeshiva University. And primarily I'm chairing. I'm not going to have that much to say, although I might ask a question. Okay, so this session, Bubbles Under the Wallpaper, Healthcare Rationing and Discrimination, presented by Nick Begstead of Rutgers University and Toby Ord of Oxford, except they're going to present in the reverse order. Toby will start, Nick will follow, and then David Wasserman, the Director of Research at the Center for Ethics at Yeshiva University, will respond. Everybody has assured me that they will stick to their time, and in fact, Nick and Toby are so concerned to be able to respond to David Wasserman's response that they will shorten their paper to respond to David Wasserman's response, and then I assure you we'll have time for Q&A. So, Toby and Nick, all yours.
Okay, thank you. So, we're here to look at a question to do with valuing lives. In particular, it's within the idea of valuing lives with the QALY approach, to look at how we should treat the values so created in decisions where we have to weigh up one type of treatment versus another type of treatment. Should we just use them at their face value? Do we need to do something else? Do we need to do special types of valuing depending on the particular case that's before us? So I will set up the problem, explain what the concerns have been, and then show how the attempts to deal with those concerns have various problems, and that in fact these problems seem to be unavoidable. And then Nick is going to look at a couple of particular attempts to avoid the unavoidable and to show that they do not avoid it. So we know that there is not enough public funding in healthcare to provide everybody with all that they might want. So therefore, there is a question about how we distribute what we have. And the approach that's used in the UK through the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, NICE, which is, I think, just recently been disbanded by the current government, making this slightly less topical, has an approach which is to rank all the treatments in terms of cost effectiveness and then to fund them in order of cost effectiveness until the budget is used up. That's the basic idea. So you work out what does the best thing per dollar or pound, and you put them into this order and you fund them in order. This has the nice advantage that it will lead to the maximum amount of health benefit given the budget that they have to operate with. So that might not be the only question leading to the maximum amount of health benefit. It might be that you care about the distribution of health benefit. It might also be that you care about questions about justice in the awarding of health benefit and so on. But it's at least something that's quite important. Any other approach will lead to less health benefit. So the people who are in favor of less health benefit, would need to explain why that is, I think. There's a kind of burden of proof aspect there. All of this assumes that we can measure health benefit. So let's have a little look at that. So what we're going to talk about is the kind of justification of the QALY approach. You probably all pretty much know what it is, and Dan mentioned it earlier, so I'll go through this really fast. You could look at the question of how many lives can you save in order to measure these things, but there's this problem that no one has ever saved a life. You think you save a life, and they just die later. We can extend lives, though. That's the relevant thing. And it matters by how much we extend them. If you had a really expensive operation that would extend life by 1 day, we might think that's in some sense saving a life, but it's a lot less relevant than extending it for 20 years. So we care about this duration of the extension. So we could move to how many life years can we save. That might be a way to get around this. But what about the quality of life? There are sometimes quality-quantity trade-offs. And also there are many cases where a health intervention will be a mere improvement of health. So mere meaning that it doesn't also improve the duration of the person's life, it only improves the quality. And you also want to take those into account. So maybe we want to do something where what we do is we look at the number of life years of extension and we weight the life years by their quality to take both of these things into account in the obvious way. Obvious not necessarily implying best, but it is, I think, the obvious way. So quality adjusted life years, the standard approach used in public health. And the idea is you look at a life schematically in terms of its health-related quality over time, and then what you do is you take the area under this graph as the qualities in the life. And if you consider a couple of different approaches, here is a life where you could improve its quality or you could improve its quantity. What you do is you look at the area of these different improvements, and you can work out how many qualities are gained in both cases. That's the approach. So there is a problem with these, which is that in many cases they give intuitive results. We should improve people's health quality. We should improve the length of their lives. In one kind of case they don't, which is a case of should you save the life of an able-bodied person or a disabled person if they're going to live for the same number of years, say, but one of them will have higher health-related quality of life than the other. This approach says you should save the one with the higher quality of life. And we think that this seems to be a case of discrimination on grounds of disability, which seems to be problematic. I mean, in some cases, it seems correct to look at someone as to whether or not they have a disability as to how we act in regards to them. Perhaps we should provide extra facilities for them if they have a disability. But in other cases, we think it's problematic. When we're using the term discrimination in this paper, we're meaning this kind of problematic looking thing, but we're not meaning to beg the question about whether it really is morally wrong. So we're not saying this is an unfair discrimination, but it is some kind of discrimination. Some people use the word discrimination to imply unfair, and we're not doing that. So it's often wrong in many cases, and some people think it's wrong in this case too, and I would say most people do. There was this case in Oregon where they were trying to move to a kind of NICE-like, NICE-like system of doing healthcare prioritization in the state of Oregon, and it was overturned on grounds of interfering with the Disability Discrimination Act. I'd also point out that, I mean, there are quite a few people who think that it's not wrong to discriminate in this case on the grounds of disability. I should also say that the type of discrimination is not actually based on the person's current disability status, but it's based on what their future disability status would be. That might be a relevant feature. So our next section is to look at, there have been various approaches to revise the quality approach. The most famous of these is to, when looking at cases of two different life extension treatments, to ignore health-related quality of life in that case. Just treat it as one, like perfect health in both cases. These seem to bring in new problems, though. And we actually, we came up with this idea for this paper at a conference in Geneva last year because a whole lot of people put forward their approaches as to how you could deal with this. And we found problems for each of these approaches. And Nick and I kind of kept raising these objections. And then we realized that it seemed that no matter how they tried to come up with these answers, there would always be one of our kind of critiques that applied. And we had a bit of a think about this and worked out that we could prove that, that there is no way to avoid one of these problems. We in particular have 4 problems, and you have to accept one of these things. And we're thankful for Dan Brock for encouraging us to write this up. So, did I say everything there? Yeah, it seems to be a bit like trying to get rid of a bubble under the wallpaper. This is the idea behind this, that you kind of keep pushing down on it and then it just appears somewhere else. Maybe it's like this, that actually you just can't eliminate this bubble ultimately. It has to go somewhere. Where is the least bad place for it to go? So here's our main case. Alice and Beth are both perfectly healthy 20-year-olds, but have recently contracted an unusual disease. This disease will kill them very soon unless treated, and even then they'll suffer from serious complications, such as blindness or a reduced lifespan. To make matters worse, there are not enough resources to treat them both. In particular, there are three options that we have. Option X is to treat Alice, and this would give her 45 years more life, but as a side effect of her illness, she'll end up blind. We could have used any disability here. In particular, we were trying to use one. The results are stronger if it's something that affects someone's health-related quality of life by a larger amount. If you think that the quality ratings that are normally used for blindness are too extreme, and it's actually not so bad, or you think that for other disabilities, feel free to substitute it with any disability that you want, that you think really is bad for someone. So option X is to treat Alice for 45 years. Option Y is to treat Beth and give her 60 years of life. Option Z is to treat, and in both cases they'd be blind. But there's a second option for Beth, which is to treat her and give her 35 years of life at full health. These are the three options, and it leads to this interesting puzzle. So it seems that if we consider X and Y in isolation, that we've got the choice of giving someone 45 years of life or giving someone else, an equivalent situation, 60 years of life. So we should obviously choose the 45 years of life, right? It seems that there's a problem there. Why would we directly, if there's only one difference, which is that someone else has less to gain, why would we give the person who has less to gain the thing? That seems a bit funny. So we might think, well, if we've got to choose one or the other, it makes sense to choose to treat Beth in this case. So it seems like there's an argument moving us from X to Y. Now consider Y and Z. In this case, with the standard quality weights, we would suggest that we want to about 0.5 for blindness. It would suggest that actually there's more to be gained for Beth in option Z. And we're supposing that Beth, like most people, she gives similar quality weights to these things, and she also prefers option Z rather than option Y. So option Z would both be preferable for her, and let's suppose she's fully informed about this. And also, we tend to think as a society it's better for her, and the doctor thinks it's better for her, and so on. That's what we're imagining in this case. So it seems like there's a pretty good argument that, why would we go against that? And finally, it seems that option X is preferable to option Z on this grounds of the disability discrimination. Because if you compare just X and Z, you think, hang on, this is a case of 45 years for someone or 35 years for someone else, and there's more to be gained by the first person. The only reason to prefer the second one is on grounds of disability, but we thought that that was dubious. So if you think about all of these things together, choosing X over Y implies a preference for smaller benefits. So this is what we call it. We just kind of gave these things descriptive names. Seems to be problematic to choose the smaller benefit rather than the larger benefit just because it's smaller. Choosing Y over Z implies a kind of pointless violation of autonomy. It might be okay to violate someone's autonomy and their choices in a case where it's actually in their interests and they're misinformed or something, but this is not a case like that. Why would we do this? Choosing Z over X implies this kind of disability discrimination. And if you avoid all of these, then you get these cyclic preferences. You think that Y is better than X, Z is better than Y, and X is better than Z. And there are various kind of economic arguments about money pumps as to why you shouldn't do this. One possibility would be a kind of rights-based approach where you give a person the right to treatment if they have more years to gain and let them use that right however they would like. So the idea here is that we would consider that Y gets the right to treatment because, so Beth gets the right to treatment because she has more years of life that she could gain. She gained 60 versus only 45. So she gets the right to treatment and she could use it how she wants in this case. And she would want to use it to pick Z. So it would choose these things from the pairs, and it would choose Z if you had all three options. You might think, hey, that seems to solve the problem a bit, does it? But it still has this cyclic preferences. So what does that mean? Well, you're open to these money pump arguments, and you can hopefully see how that goes. But you might think it's not that bad, as there's a pairwise circle, but out of all three options, at least there's a clear winner. But it is a real problem. It violates something called the independence of irrelevant alternatives, which is another way to think about what's going wrong. So imagine that there are vials of medicine for each of the treatments X, Y, and Z. And consider this case where you're considering the case, and all three options are available. You're the doctor. You're going over to the desk to get the correct vial. And you think, OK, I've analyzed this. We need to get vial Z because that's the right treatment. And then it turns out vial Y just falls off and shatters on the ground. And you think, oh, hang on, now we're in a situation where it's out of X and Z. So we have to do picked X, and you kind of go back to the table and put the vial Z back down and pick up. There seems like something funny is happening here, right? There's this thing that we weren't even going to use. That option is removed, and then it changes our behavior. Another way to think about it is suppose that you've got X and Z as possibilities, and you're thinking, oh, I think I should do X. But then you think, well, maybe option Y is available. I'm not sure if it's available or not. It depends on whether she has a certain condition. So you go and do this study just to see whether she has this condition, which you're not going to treat. And it seems, why should we actually waste our time and money doing that when there's a patient before us, but we don't know how to treat without knowing if that option's available? It seems kind of irrational in various ways, and it violates the axioms of rationality. We have other examples of that, but this is the basic idea. So now over to Nick.
Okay. Sorry about that. So, one kind of response that you could have to this is to say, well, actually, there are more options than the ones that we described. So you might think, in a practical case, there wouldn't just be option X, option Y, and option Z. There would also be all the lotteries that you could do over things. So we could flip coins, roll some dice, draw numbers out of hats, and so forth, and have all the different possible lotteries that you could use. So could that be a solution to the problem? That's a question. And many people think, for various reasons, that lotteries are required in cases of fairness, in cases where we have indivisible goods, that fairness requires that we do this, so it's not a totally crazy approach. We are kind of not convinced that this is the way to go on independent grounds. We're not going to pursue that kind of response here. A more fundamental point is that it doesn't really seem like a solution to this as a philosophical problem to say, well, actually, there's this other case where we could have more options, because we can just imagine the case where the only options are X, Y, and Z. And if your theory has implausible implications in just this one case, that's still a problem for you. It would be less of a practical problem because we could actually, in practice, always do these lotteries. So I think it's still worth talking about whether this solution actually works. But another kind of problem before we get into that is that, while it might seem plausible to use this kind of system when you have a more clinical case where you have a few patients, it seems less plausible to go in for lotteries when you're doing priority setting for a much larger population. We think that fewer people would want to go in for flipping coins to decide which diseases need to be researched or which kinds of clinics need to be built. So even if this would work in certain clinical contexts, we think it's not promising as a general solution for that kind of reason. But now we're going to argue that even if you go that way, you still get into a lot of trouble, and trouble of fundamentally the same sort if you go in for a lottery solution to this kind of problem. So let's go back to our original case where we have Alice and Beth and our 3 treatment options. There's going to be 3 very analogous problems that we are going to want to avoid here. The first problem is we're not going to want to design a lottery that gives, we're going to want a lottery that gives Beth a greater chance of receiving the benefit than Alice. And that's because Beth is getting a substantially greater benefit than Alice in this kind of case. Some people might want to say, actually, I want to give them an equal chance in this kind of case. And we discussed that a little bit in the paper. We think that's going to be implausible if we made the difference in years big enough, and we could to make, to run this example. But in any case, we think we're going to want to give Beth a greater chance in this kind of case if we're going to do a lottery. The second kind of problem we're going to want to avoid has to do with the pointless violation of autonomy. So we think if option Z really is better for Beth than Y, and that's what she wants under an informed situation, that's what she freely would choose, we think we should just go ahead and give her Z. We shouldn't force her to take Y, and furthermore, we shouldn't force her to do a gamble between Y and Z or something like that. We think that would be unreasonable in this kind of case. The third condition that we're going to want to avoid is, again, a generalization of the disability discrimination. So we don't want to, if we found it offensive to give the treatment to Alice, give her X rather than Z in that kind of case. The analog of that would be giving Alice, we don't want to give Beth the treatment when the choice is between X and Z. The analog of that in the probability case would be giving Beth a greater chance of treatment when the options are X and Z. And for the same kinds of reasons that seemed like disability discrimination when you're just straight up choosing it, it also seems like disability discrimination when you're giving that thing a greater chance. Now, just looking at that, we already are kind of getting into trouble because we have something very similar arising. We think Y deserves greater probability than X, we think Z deserves greater probability than Y, and we think X deserves greater probability than Z. But intuitively, you should only be giving something greater probability if it's more important in that context. And it seems like more important should be a transitive relation. But more importantly, there's another kind of argument you can use here. If you avoid all of these three conditions, you introduce a fourth kind of dependence on irrelevant treatments, as we called it. So you might think, if you're a patient and a new treatment for your condition is discovered, that should never decrease your chance of getting treated in an allocation system. It'd be bizarre to say, well, we found a new way of treating you, so we're going to decrease your chance of getting treated. Sorry, that doesn't make a lot of sense, but that's what we do here. We don't want to have that. And the other thing it seems like we don't want to have is if you're a patient and they introduce a new treatment for someone else that they could have, but that's a treatment that the other person doesn't even want. It's not even better for them. That also shouldn't decrease your chance of getting treated. And we show in this paper that the argument's pretty simple, but I don't want to go through all the details here because it has a few steps. It's impossible to avoid all four of those problems. So we think moving to the lottery solution doesn't really work to get around the problems that we're worried about here. So to summarize, in the case of Alice and Beth, we have to accept one of these four undesirable conditions. We have to have this sort of preference for smaller benefits, a pointless violation of autonomy, disability discrimination, or introduce a cyclic ranking. For the reasons that we described, we tend to find the first two options to be the least palatable ones. Wherever we go here, it's not going to be we're going to go in for something unpalatable, but those seem to be, to us, to be the least plausible. Some people may want to go for cyclic preferences in these kinds of cases. We find this unsatisfying for theoretical reasons, but some people may be happy if these cases don't arise very often in practice, or if we have some method of kind of getting around the money pumps. We have some system set in so that we don't actually waste the whole public health budget moving around in circles. We think this is an indirect argument that the discrimination involved in the Qualy approach is actually acceptable because all the other systems we've shown are going to face problems of their own and problems that are arguably worse. It's also a nice example of a wider phenomenon in ethics. We have a tendency to have clear theories with predictions about all kinds of cases. And we have this standard where if you can produce one or a few counterexamples to these cases where pre-theoretically we think otherwise than what this theory says, many people have a tendency to just outright reject that kind of approach. But what we've shown here is that, sometimes all theories are going to have this kind of property. So we think a general methodological moral is if you're attacking a more complete theory using a less complete theory that says less about all kinds of cases, you should be careful to try to dethrone the alternatives with just one or a few counterexamples, because the next kind of impossibility argument could well be around the corner. Thanks.
Okay, Beckstead and Ord seek to show that we cannot avoid three problems in healthcare allocation: preferences for smaller benefits, pointless violations of autonomy, and disability discrimination without giving rise to cyclical pairwise preferences. I don't doubt that if we take these problems as defined, their avoidance does lead to intransitivity. Rather, I think that two of the three problems that give rise to the cycle are not problematic at all, or much less so than the authors assume. So in a sense, I'm finding their framework immensely useful because I'm disagreeing with them almost diametrically. This is not going to be a technical response to them. It's going to be saying thank you for identifying these assumptions, and I picked the opposite ones. There is arguably no violation of autonomy, let alone a pointless one, in limiting the recipient's use of a scarce resource to the specific purpose that gives his claim to the resource priority over other claims, even if he would prefer to use it for another purpose. And although it may be perverse to prefer a small benefit in longevity to A over a larger one to B, when the alternative for either is immediate death, it is not obviously perverse to be indifferent between the two benefits, at least when the difference between them is not extreme, since the benefits accrue to different people. Because I do not think we face all of the problems that the authors see as giving rise to a cycle, I do not think that we need to worry about this particular intransitivity. But I have no confidence that our preferences or even our values about scarce resource allocation are coherent. So the denial of a particular intransitivity may be small solace. And were I confronted with another intransitivity, my recourse would be to say we need to learn to live with cyclical preferences, which Alexander Friedman has argued is a feature of any suitably complex ethical theory. But I'm not going to go there now. So first, pointless violations of autonomy. A violation of autonomy might be found in ordinary circumstances where a patient was denied the freedom to choose one of two treatments because her doctor considered the other one to have a more valuable outcome. Even then, it would not be a pointless violation of autonomy. The doctor might give strong priority to life extension over the preservation of specific sensory or motor functions. The doctor might regard giving Beth option Z rather than option Y as almost the moral equivalent of performing an operation that would save her vision but reduce her lifespan by 25 years, something he could in good conscience refuse to do. Of course, he would not be causing Beth's loss of years by allowing her to choose option Z. Still, he might not want to assist in what he saw as a deeply misguided sacrifice of 25 years. His reluctance might be supported by a belief that Beth's aversion to option Y was probably based, despite what the authors in the full paper describe as considerable research and reflection, on ignorance and misinformation about what it would be like to live the remaining 60 years of her life blind, that she would be very likely to have no regrets about choosing that option once she adapted to her lack of vision and started to look forward to the additional 25 years. The authors maintain, again in the full paper, that experts concur with Beth's judgments, but it's not clear what expertise they could bring to bear on this choice. Health professionals are hardly experts on what makes a life go well. In any case, the choice between option Y and Z up here can't be framed as one between two medical options for Beth, between which she has a presumptive right to choose. That choice takes place in the context of allocating scarce resources, and in that context, it is no violation of autonomy, or a justifiable one, to limit what Beth can do with a scarce resource. If she were higher up on the list for organs than the wealthy Alice, Beth could not sell the organ to Alice once she received it, even if she preferred the money to the organ, and for good reason, if it would pay for a life-saving operation for another family member. It would not violate her autonomy or would do so justifiably to deny her an option that both she and Alice strongly preferred. The organ is not her property to dispense with as she chooses. Her claim to it is based entirely on the established criteria for transplants. She lacks an alienable right to the organ and does not acquire one when her name comes up. In the author's original case, the state or allocation agency should be seen as awarding healthcare vouchers good only for life-prolonging treatment. The recipient has no right to cash hers in or to trade it in for vision-preserving treatment. Now, the authors initially do not specify allocation criteria where they present the original Alice Beth case. But if we see, as I do, disability discrimination as a problem that must be avoided, we will be compelled to adopt the key feature of the rights priority-based approach they go on to describe. To the extent priority is based on life years saved, those years must not be adjusted for quality or disability. An allocation scheme could consistently recognize other factors such as years of waiting, number of dependents, etc., but the authors don't consider these, and I see no need to. Given that that criterion, option Z above should be treated as the worst or least preferred option, inferior to X or Y. This ranking requires us to override Beth's own preferences, which reflect values that are incompatible with those underlying an explicitly rights-based allocation scheme. Beth, of course, would not violate her own rights in choosing fewer years cited over more years blind, but the priority she would place on quality of life is rejected by the scheme that would award her the scarce resources. Under a scheme that treats all future life years as equal, it is entirely appropriate to ignore disability adjustment by potential recipients, to disregard their preferences for a shorter life without a disability to a longer life with it. And if we are willing to disregard those preferences, we do not confront a cycle. I will not discuss the author's claim that randomness cannot rescue our decisions from a cycle. I suspect it's correct if you find all three problems problematic, because I do not think they need rescue. It is only if we find it unjustifiable to limit autonomy so as to avoid its allegedly pointless violation that our decisions are vulnerable to the cycles the authors describe. I conclude that they have performed a valuable service by demonstrating the cost and coherence that we pay if we insist on embracing, in addition to our other commitments, a notion of autonomy that requires us to honor an individual's preferences with respect to the use of resources to which he has no right or she has no right, especially when those preferences are inconsistent with the priorities embodied in the allocation scheme that would award him those resources. So in conclusion, and I'll skip the part on perverse preferences unless you're going to respond to that. Their analysis nicely highlights the tension between, first, a public commitment to longevity over assumed quality of life, and second, a public commitment to honoring an individual's preference for assumed quality of life over longevity. I've been arguing that with those clearly framed alternatives, we should pick the first and discard the second.
Just very briefly, there's a lot there, so I'm just going to pick three of those strands. So I see one kind of response to what we presented here as the idea that maybe the quality weights are not given properly, so really maybe option Z isn't better for Beth than option Y. And in this kind of case, yeah, we could say it wouldn't be a pointless violation of autonomy, and maybe that would make it more palatable to adopt that. To take that route. A second kind of response that I see here is that when you have a case where we're allocating some scarce resources, it can make sense to limit the use that someone might make of the scarce resources that they're allocated. And perhaps that could explain why what we've called the pointless violation of autonomy would be acceptable. And the third strand that I want to respond to is the idea that if we want to avoid disability discrimination, then we're going to be forced into violating autonomy anyway. So just starting with the last point, I actually don't think that that's correct, that we must face this choice. And I think the rights-based approach that we described in the paper shows that we do not have to choose between disability discrimination and pointless violation of autonomy. When we go with the rights-based approach, we award the right to treatment to whoever can gain the most years of life, and then we leave it up to them which treatment they're going to get. So this is never going to discriminate against the disabled. However, it's never going to have the pointless violation of autonomy happening. So I disagree with that claim that we have to face that choice. But I think the other points of this are more substantial, so let me just respond to those quickly. As for this first idea about maybe the quality weights aren't working properly, the bedrock assumption behind our pointless violation of autonomy condition is that if somebody makes a free, informed choice about a healthcare outcome in a way that makes their life go better, then and doesn't harm anybody else, then we should honor that preference. So we're not considering cases where we're discussing things that aren't health benefits, like Stradivarius examples or anything like that. We're just talking about healthcare here. Now, we wanted Beth's case to be a case where option Z really was better for her than Y, and I think you can reasonably argue that the weights are set in properly. And indeed, this is a big part of the discourse on disability discrimination with these weights. So, you know, it's helpful to be reminded of that. However, we think that the issues that we're discussing here are orthogonal to what you think about those quality weights. So we can say, look, you tell us how to rank health outcomes for a single individual, what would be better for them, and we'll construct a version of this problem using your favorite ranking. What's essential, as long as your ranking has the feature that it's sometimes better to shorten your life in order to avoid living with some kind of disability or lower quality of life, you're going to have examples of this kind. So we could do a variation if that's the kind of response that's really worrying people. And the last worry has to do with the possibility that we could justifiably limit Beth's use of scarce healthcare resources. And to make this argument, Wasserman leans on the claim that we can refuse to allow someone to sell an organ that they're about to receive through some allocation system, though it might be a free, informed choice that, you know, that results in a Pareto improvement. I think this example doesn't work as well to motivate the idea that pointless violation of autonomy in our preferred sense could be okay for a couple of reasons. For one thing, I'm not sure I'm convinced that that we shouldn't let this patient sell their organ, but I'm not going to stress that. I think the more important thing is that since the patient we're talking about needs the organ to live, this isn't an example where selling the organ is in the patient's interest. It doesn't actually make their life go better. So I think the general moral here is, even if it's true that we can sometimes limit someone's use of a candidate resource, we need to have good reasons to restrict people's rights to make free, informed choices that serve their own interests and don't violate the interests of anyone else. And I'm not convinced that in Beth's case we have compelling reasons of that kind.
Thank you.
So I actually think the way we've done it improves the power of the argument, because we have a very clear kind of interpersonal comparison where the benefits are easier to compare, and then we have the intrapersonal comparison going on in a different kind of way where it's harder to compare, but we agree that, you know, we do have to make these quality-quantity trade-offs in a certain kind of way. The logical structure, as I see it, is someone comes and says, quality approach fails because it discriminates against the disabled. We need to find a new approach. Our suggestion is, okay, you can try to find a new approach. However, all the other approaches are going to face problems of their own, and we think those problems are worse. And I think we can get that by doing Y as we've done it. I think it depends on what you think is objectionable about it. We could modify the case so that it does fit the normal framework, but it would make it a little bit more complicated. So the way we would modify it is we would set things up so that Alice had recently become blind. And, you know, we can make that as recent as you like for it to be the case that it counts as disability discrimination. So maybe she's been blind for a year now. And in that kind of case, it does seem like it would fit the paradigm of disability discrimination to favor Beth over Alice on the grounds that Beth could be healthy, and we're going to count healthy life as more than life that's blind. Well, we were meant to be considering a case in which Y, so when we're doing this pairwise, we're considering cases in which Y isn't an option. So that is a case in which Beth will definitely be sighted and Alice will definitely be blind.
Yeah, that's not, I mean, there's some slight unclarity as to how we presented it quickly here, but the cycle comes up with the set of pairwise cases. So if we consider just a case with X versus Y, then it is the case that Beth will be determinately blind if she's going to live at all. And if we consider just a case with Y and Z is the case where it's not. But then the idea is that we can show that you get this pairwise cycle with things like the rights-based approach. If they're all three of them available at once, you don't have a cycle at once. However, you do have this violation of the independence of relevant alternatives. So we think that we really can address that question.
You could certainly have cases where, you know, you've set things up so that if you make a certain kind of choice when certain options are present, then all sorts of bad consequences will follow, and you know, and that I think we're perfectly happy to accept should influence the way that you handle the situation. I think it changes the options that are available, and we should really represent it differently if, you know, we're hooked up to some virus releasing machine if we choose one of these options or something like that. But yeah, maybe I think you're right to point out that there are some factors that really should be on this graph. So I think it's relevant if you live in a society where people get really upset if you choose option Z over option X. And, you know, we should be weighing that if people are getting really upset about it. I guess I feel like we are still responding to this kind of literature in an important way, because normally it's sort of thought of as this sort of non-conventional kind of requirements of fairness that we treat options Z and X. And in the kind of situation you're describing, it's only because people get upset when you do it, or we've made kind of agreements in the past or something like that, that we would have to be taking account of some of those factors. So I feel like, yes, maybe there is room for some of those considerations, but it feels like a very different kind of consideration than people are usually appealing to when they're upset about disability discrimination.
I would also add to that there are kind of two questions. One question is, what are the theoretical reasons? How should we do this in theory? The other question is, how should we practically implement some of these things? And I don't think the theory, I mean, I think that if you accept, if you try to avoid 1, 2, and 3, and you accept cyclic preferences, I think this does make it irrational and incoherent as a theory if it has these cyclic preferences. And so it could be that people just say, you know, we're going to write unless you do something that's incoherent, in which case you should do something that's incoherent, perhaps. But that's kind of a separate question. A lot of philosophers who we're responding to seem to say it's not incoherent. They think, hey, this is a great theory. So we want to firstly argue it's not a great theory if it has these problems they hadn't noticed. And in fact, there's no great theory that avoids all of these things. But then there are this separate question about what should we do in the particular case. What we're really saying there is that choosing X over Z is a particular thing that you could do, and we give it a name, which is disability discrimination, which is because people say, hey, this quality approach makes you choose X over Z, and that's disability discrimination. That's why we use the name. I mean, if someone happens to not call it that, or if they have built into the idea of discrimination that is unfair or something, that we don't want to have to buy into that. We could have just called these things 1, 2, and 3 without putting names on them. But I think, I mean, I think that the argument therefore goes through that you can't get away from having either 1, 2, 3, or 4 as something you have to accept. I think that's maybe our fault for saying full health. We could have said HRQL equals 1 or something. We're saying this is a situation where her instantaneous health-related quality of life is at the maximum or the societal norm, and that it's going to continue like that until she dies. So I think that everything goes through. It's just, in some sense, we were just saying she's got instantaneous full health rather than that she's got lifetime full health. I mean, full health as in there's no health problems. As in instantaneously, her abilities aren't impacted or anything during that particular time period. Thank you for the comments. I mean, that's right, that in some sense you could look at 2 as a subspecies of 1 and say that it is another case of smaller benefits. And I mean, how you look at disability as a production of utility or something. I mean, that's one way to look at it, and which might make people less worried about the whole situation. Thanks.
Yes. I think this gets back to where we're asking whether or not Z really is better than Y. And I think for most of these cases that we could put up there, we're going to get people who disagree about which health state over a whole life is better. That's why I really want to emphasize that whether you agree with the way that the quality weights are actually used is orthogonal to the argument that we're making. So you tell us how to trade off between health-related quality of life at a time and duration of life for a single person. And we'll be able to construct an example of this kind, provided you agree that it sometimes makes sense to decrease duration of life in order to increase quality. And maybe that varies from person to person. Fine, build all that in. You tell us how to rank it, and we'll do the same thing.
Yeah. I mean, further to what Nick was saying, I mean, if we had more time, we could have constructed one of these examples for every person in the room based on what, their quality ratings they put in for things, as long as there is anything where they trade off quality for health. If they think being, in a vegetative state, I'd trade that off against length of life, then we can come up with examples. And in fact, you can all come up with your own examples. This stuff is pretty easy. Once you've seen how to do it, it's not that hard to put numbers on it and work them out. So we definitely encourage people to challenge themselves on it if they think that they don't agree with these particular numbers.
I think we're about out of time. I'd like to make one last comment, which is whether health-related quality of life and quality of life are the same. I don't think they are. Health-related quality of life is one component of quality of life. And I think if you add that, you may have a larger problem. Thank you.